Hey, this is Ken from Coffee Crafters, and we wanted to do an updated video covering things that may not be in the manual, but things that roasters need to understand, especially new roasters. And one of the things, when you get your roaster, it's going to come with a logbook. We get lots of questions about where do I set my roaster for my first roast? You know, what settings do I use? How do I do the loft, whatever? And one of the difficult things for us is answering that question with any accuracy, because it's an electric fluid bed roaster. And one of the things that that we know is that not everybody's power is the same. So what we would tell somebody as a starting point might be a low setting for somebody or a high setting for somebody else. So we're going to explain to you how to work through that. But in the roast log, this comes with the roaster. One of the things that you want to do is log your first roast, and you want to know where the settings are, where your heat setting is, what your room temperature is, how big of a batch it is. So make sure to weigh it so you know how much you're putting in there. And then what you want to try to capture is what heat setting you're going to use on different load sizes, because you can do more complicated things by adjusting the heat throughout the roast. What we found is the best over time. Find that one setting that takes you through the entire roast from start to finish, that parks you in that 8 to 12 minute window. And when you do that, it makes the roasting part easy, which it really is. You'll read a lot of things about the drying phase, going up a little more in the beginning. And what we've found over time is that when we roast it in that sweet spot window, even the expert cuppers can't tell the difference. They can tell when we get outside of that, and we're going to cover that a little bit too. So big thing in the beginning, make sure to log your roast so that you know what's going on. All right, next we're going to talk about the loft. And one of the things that you want to do when you're getting ready to roast is you put your beans in there, and then you establish the loft without turning the heat on, just to kind of get used to it. One of the things that you will notice with all fluid bed roasters roasting in a conical hopper is the loft is much more sensitive at the beginning of the roast than it is at the end of the roast. So once it's stabilized and settles down, once you get past 350 degree bean temperature, it starts to settle down, and you have a lot more adjustment that you can make without killing the loft. Because what you don't do with a fluid bed roaster like this is walk away from it, especially in the beginning, because the loft setting between lofting 3 to 5 inches and killing the loft is really small in the beginning. And the reason for that is because the beans are very small, dense, and heavy, and their range of performance on the dial is much shorter than it is when you get up a little bit with a bean that is not as dense, that's starting to expand. They fly easier. It lowers the pressure inside that it takes to loft them, and that's why you find yourself turning the loft down, because it doesn't take as much air to maintain the loft. So when you're doing your loft on any load size, try to maintain that 3 to 5 inch loft height. Don't let it go too far below that, and that'll keep you in the range so that it's lofting correctly. Next thing we want to talk about is adjusting the temperature throughout the roast cycle. So you may want to turn the temperature up if your bean temperature rate of rise is lagging behind, or you might want to slow it down. If you want to increase the temperature rate of rise on the bean from watching the bean temperature, there are two ways to do that. One, we can turn it up on the dial if we have, extra dial left. The other way is to turn the loft down, because the way the heat works is we're blowing that air past the heating element. So if we turn the loft down, we have less CFM going by that heat element, and it will heat that air up to a higher temperature more quickly. Conversely, if it's getting up to temperature too quickly, and we see that we're getting a bean temperature rate of rise of faster than 1 degree per second, we want to turn that down. We can either turn the loft up a little bit to slow it down, or we can turn the heat down. My preference, when I want to turn the heat down, is just to use the dial over here and turn it down just a little bit. Turn it down a half a notch. So if you're roasting on 6, turn it down to 5.5 and see if that settles it down a little bit. So you can do that both ways, and it's important to remember that the Loft is just good to control over the heat to make micro adjustments as the heat switch. Another big question is, where do I set the heat for each load size? And there are two main things that make it different from one location to the other. The one is your true line voltage. And this is something we deal with every week with customers, because even if they have an electrician come in, they'll say, okay, what's my voltage? They'll check their voltage, not under load, and say, okay, you got 240 volt at your outlet. But if you're at the end of the string from the transformer, one of the things that happens is we call that dirty power, which is you will be very susceptible to line voltage surge by your line draw. So under load, you turn your roaster on under load, and all of a sudden you're roasting at 230 volt. And I can tell you, your roaster will not perform up to spec at 230 volt as compared to 240 volt. Conversely, I was talking to someone this morning, and they have 248 volt. And when they're roasting 10-pound loads, this was on their XE, when they were roasting 10-pound loads, they had to turn it down to 7 for it not to have the temperature go all the way up to shutoff temperature. So it makes a big difference between 230 volt and 240 volt. And when you're over 240 volt on either machine, either the Artisan 3 or the Artisan XE, you'll actually have to turn it down on full loads. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to get used to starting your load, especially when you get started new. On this Artisan 3 right here, if I was going to tell somebody where do I set this at for a 1-pound roast, put a pound in there, set it at 5.5, and see where you go. Because if you have good voltage at 5.5, you're going to come out just about right. If your voltage is really low, you may have to turn it up to 6 for it to roast a full load. And there are two ways to adjust the heat. You can adjust it with the Loft by turning the Loft up or down. If you turn the Loft down a little bit lower, the heat will rise without having to touch the heat, because the reason that happens is we're blowing air at a certain CFM past that heat element. If we have fewer CFM going by there without killing the Loft, obviously, it's going to heat it up much faster than it does if you have more air going through there. So making micro adjustments, I will use the Loft first. If I need to turn it more than that, I'll go ahead and use the heat dial. But like as an example, for a 1-pound load, set it at 5.5 and see where you get, and make sure that you log that and your room temperature, so that when you do the next roast, if you need to tweak it a little bit different, you can set it different and then log it again. So the later year models of Artisan 3 and obviously the XE, we have a light, a roast light. One of the things you do not want to do that we see people do often is they will stick the light through the hopper on the inside, and that will burn it up. That burns up that LED light. You want it at least 3/4 of an inch away from it, and there's actually air flowing around here, so that will air cool it and it will never burn. And one of the things about this light, this LED light, the light shining on the beans when they're roasting will make them look lighter than they actually are. So one of the things you want to get used to is not looking at that color from the light. That's more to show you what's going on inside the hopper, make sure the beans are lofting, whatever. But you want to be able to trust your bean temperature reading, because what you'll get used to and rely on more than anything, more than the light, more than the roast air temperature, is you're going to get used to your bean thermometer, both for where your roast profile is and on the darkness scale, and and checking that bean temperature rate of rise, so we know that the length of the roast is going to come out right. So one of the things you want to do when you get started with this thermometer is you want to calibrate it. And you might ask, why do I need to calibrate it? Isn't this supposed to be accurate? No, none of them are accurate. So in the last 10 years, the one thing that's driven me the most crazy about coffee roasting is how inaccurate thermometers and thermocouple probes are. If I take 10 thermometers out of the box and plug them into the same thermocouple probe, I'll get 10 different readings, and vice versa. If I take 10 probes, plug them into the same thermometer, I'm going to get a different reading. The only way we figured out to have any type of a reasonable solution to that problem was to get a thermometer that has a calibration screw. And so if you get in here close, Bryce, you'll see that on this DigiSense thermometer, we have a L and an H, a low and a high. What you want to do is calibrate when you hear first crack starting in earnest, calibrate it to 400 degrees at first crack, and then leave it. And once you leave it, it will stay there, because that thermometer probe and then that thermometer are as close as they're going to get. We used to try to calibrate them by putting the thermometer in ice water, but what we found is there's enough temperature swing in accuracy between freezing and 400 degrees, you know, that it could throw it still way off. So the best way to do it was to audibly listen to first crack, set it at 400 degrees, and then trust this temperature more than anything. And that will be the best way to get that consistency from roast to roast. In conclusion, one of the things we wanted to cover was one of the things that we go through every day on the phone with, especially with new roasters, and that is overthinking it and overcomplicating it, because actually roasting is the easy part. There's nothing you can do to really screw it up if you keep it in that roast window 8 to 12 minutes. You're going to read all kinds of stuff online about how we need to tweak it a little bit here for this bean, a little bit there for that bean. One of the reasons we don't get involved in that conversation, it's like getting 10 chefs in the same room and arguing about how much ingredient they put in each one and how much difference it makes. To the general public, if you want to give them a good cup of coffee, keep it in the sweet spot. If you can find that one roast setting that gets you all the way through that 3-pound load or that 1-pound load or a 10-pound load on the XE, leave it in the same place every time. Worry about your marketing and some of the other things that are going to help you be more successful, because those little tiny adjustments, it might make a difference to a coffee snob, but the general coffee drinking public is never going to know the difference most of the time. So keep it simple, have fun, and if you have any questions about roasting, just give us a call. We have people here to help you all the time. If you're doing maintenance, you need any questions about cleaning or something, there's always somebody here to help you, and just have some fun.